Well, good morning. We are.
Burn off the hair.
You got it?
Thank you. Good turnout today. Use a different one. Yeah, we are finishing up here with Dr. Francisco. Some of you weren't able to come yesterday, and I'm glad you're able to come today. But Dr. Francisco's he was at Irvine and at the seminary in Fort Wayne, and he's taught at, he currently teaches in Chicago, right? At the Concordia in Chicago sometimes?
Sometimes, when I want.
When he wants to. But he also, there's some info out there if you'd like to hear some of his stuff. There's a podcast that he's normally on, and so there's some information out there at the table. Take it, and I also put, most of you probably have it, but I have catechisms, which are always coming in, what do Christians believe, and it's just a small catechism. Take them and give them to friends. Or just take them if you don't have your catechism, because it was a long time ago when you went through it. Take it and live in it each day. But let's begin with the psalm appointed for today. It's actually Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the word of the Lord. And on his word he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. And all he does, he prospers, but the wicked are not so. They're like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked will perish. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen.
Amen.
Go for it. Dr. Francisco.
He told me I could do whatever I wanted. So I mulled it over, and I was thinking, well, whatever. It's almost deer season. I thought we could talk about archery, but just kidding. Yesterday we had, for those who weren't here, we had, was it 8 hours? Was it 9 to 4, I think it was? It was a while.
9 to 4, yeah.
My feet are still kind of aching. On, I don't know, what do we title it? Christianity in the Public Arena. We looked at a number of things with some history and some ideas floating around, historical and present ideas in our culture. We talked, the last hour and a half was on Christian apologetics for Lutherans, just a sort of little dipping our toe into it. We made a few side comments, or I made a few side comments yesterday about, or illustrated something from Luther's writings on how Christians ought to think about living in a hostile culture. In his day and age, it was an Ottoman Islamic culture out of Turkey, as it was expanding into Europe. Last night I was thinking, well, I have a number of options. When he says you can do whatever, he wasn't suggesting I could do whatever. Practice some discipline here. But I thought, well, we could do all sorts of things. And I was thinking this morning, I got up, there was a party going on again at my hotel last night, so I got up early again. That was fine. It was whatever. People were having fun. And they're all, as I was making way out to the car this morning, they're all at breakfast, sort of. And I thought, well, what about talking just a bit about, because I love history. Some of you probably could tell that yesterday, and I love when I have a captive audience who maybe doesn't even, or despises history, because then I get to talk about history to a captive audience and they have no choice but to listen. And it's best usually, I think, on Saturday mornings, but a Sunday morning will do. And I was thinking about Holy Cross Day. I've never done any sort of deep exploration of it, but there's some fascinating stories with the history behind the festival of Holy Cross. There's a great theology to it, and I would, if you're so inclined, the pastor mentioned that I work with and for 1517. We do podcasts and books and articles and things of that sort. There's a great essay that was written maybe 4 years ago by a LCMS pastor named John Bombaro on the Feast of Holy Cross, or Festival of the Holy Cross. That is, I mean, it is like, John Bombaro is just sharp, but he gives the Lutheran theology of why we still practice this festival that is embedded deeply in medieval Christian history and very much tied to the practice of venerating relics, the stuff Luther protested, you know, and but there's still a history behind it, and it's a fascinating history because one of the problems with it is though that the further you go back in history, the less precision you can have. Source material just kind of is vague, or sometimes it's missing, and there's medieval and late antique or ancient culture believe it or not, didn't practice things the way we do. They didn't keep records of everything, like in footnotes and stuff like that. So the story, it's hard to piece together the story in a way that a modern historian who's interested in some sort of precision and facticity, if you will. But here it goes. We're going to kind of do a quick overview because it's a fascinating story. I'm going to try to my best to tie it into the Protestant Reformation and Luther's elevation of the cross and what's sometimes called his theology of the cross. We'll see if I do that. And I got to make sure as you know from yesterday, I'm a little long-winded, so I'm going to keep this here. I should set an alarm, but this is a new watch and I don't know how to do it yet. So the festival or the Feast of Holy Cross is a historic day in the church calendar celebrated by Western Christians, those who are on the Gregorian calendar as opposed to the old Julian calendar, on September 14th. But usually churches will celebrate on the nearest Sunday, at least Protestant churches. And there's a whole lot of Protestant churches that do not recognize this day or set it aside. The further you get into Reformed and then even further into the Anabaptist type of churches, that is, churches that would stress a rebaptism, would deny infant baptism, those sorts of things, they won't recognize it at all. Many of them don't even like putting a corpus or the body of Jesus on a cross. Some don't even like hanging a cross in a church and so on. But it's been practiced for some time. The earliest story we have about what event motivated this Sunday, the event is not Jesus' crucifixion on Good Friday. We commemorate that on Good Friday. This is very much a festival about the cross itself, the physical wooden object of the cross. And as far as historians who wonk out on this sort of stuff can discern, it all begins with a story around the 320s AD with the mother of the first Christian Roman emperor, a guy named Constantine or Constantine, depending on what side of the Atlantic you're on. And I can never remember how I'm supposed to pronounce it in American, so I'll just say Constantine, who was embroiled in a battle in the early 4th century over the right to rule over Rome. And at that time, in the early 4th century, the Roman Empire stretches all across the Mediterranean and deep into what we call the Middle East, even to the northern parts of what we call Saudi Arabia. So it's a massive empire. There's all sorts of contests for the right to rule over that empire. There's all sorts of, especially as you get into the late 200s, early 300s, lots of desire on the part of emperors and other authorities to put a stop to anything that might cause the empire to become decentralized and kind of break apart. One of the chief enemies from the perspective of Roman emperors of the empire was Christianity. It was thought, right before Constantine, there was an emperor named Diocletian who thought that the empire is massive, it needs to be fixed administratively, so he breaks up the office of emperor into 4 different co-emperors. We don't really care about that here so much, I don't think, but he also realized that the cohesion of the Roman people was starting to dissolve with Christianity becoming increasingly popular in the late 200s. So he decided, a little differently than earlier emperors who who legitimized local persecutions, or at least as they heard about persecutions of Christians in like Asia Minor or Egypt, they would approve it, but they wouldn't. More often than not, it wasn't like this universal thing where they're like giving orders or edicts to hunt down Christians everywhere. With Diocletian, that changes. That's the late 200s. He issues what are called the Diocletian Edicts, which is a general universal order that anywhere somebody is suspected, or a group of people are suspected of being Christians, they're to be rounded up and interrogated to see, in fact, if they are Christians. They could get out of any sort of punishment or execution if they agreed to renounce Christianity. And the symbol of their renunciation was offering up a pinch of incense, lighting a little, not like the stuff you buy in hippie shops, but like a little thing of incense they'd throw in the fire, and you get some smoke and smells out of it. And that would be the symbol that somebody has apostatized and they'd be let free. But those who refused, like earlier persecutions, oftentimes endured some tremendous torture before they were finally put to death. It could include anything from, like in Egypt, they were quite fond of taking Christians and just cutting pieces of skin off of them until they finally died. And that was like an hours long, sometimes a couple days long process. In Rome, they liked to chain Christians to the center of the Colosseum, and then they just open up gates, and lions, and quite literally lions, tigers, and bears would come out and have at them, and all sorts of other horrendous things in between. Diocletian retires at the very end of the 200s. And then there's this contest for who's going to take over the reins of the empire. Diocletian had divided up into 4 different administrative posts. There's a conflict and desire on the part of some to bring it back under one emperor. And this guy named Constantine, who's a thoroughgoing, as far as we know, pagan, very much like Constantine and Marcus Aurelius and Caesar Augustus and all the rest of them. But he has a mother named named Helena, who's sainted, Saint Helena, who was a Christian. And how much influence his mother had on him, we have no idea. We don't have a whole lot of good records about Constantine until after his conversion, and the first post-biblical church historian actually writes a history of all this, a guy named Eusebius. Anyway, he tells us that on what's called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, as he's planning to fight another competitor for the emperorship in Rome, as he's meeting with his army, they're deciding what tactics they're going to employ the next day, and then he orders everybody to go get some rest because it's going to be a long day and the day following. And the story goes, and I don't know if any of you, when you went to college, were part of these fraternities, but there's a fraternity out there called the Sigma Chi or Sigma Chi fraternity that is named after this, and has their secret rites or whatever these fraternities. I don't even want to know what fraternities do. I've heard stories, but some of the things they do is named after this event. And the event is Constantine goes to sleep that night, and he gets this vision, and it's a vision. In short, there's like 3, maybe 4 different accounts of it, and they all differ in some of the details, but basically it's a vision of a white cross, and across that cross is the words, "In hoc signo vinces." By this sign, or in this sign, you will conquer, the sign of the cross. So he gets up the next morning, he orders his military to paint white crosses on their shields and march into battle, and lo and behold, I think around 306 AD is when the battle took place. They decimate his opposers' army. He attributes his success then shortly thereafter to that vision. And at that point he's a pagan, but he knows he's got to know something about Christianity from his mother. Did he convert at that point? Did he renounce paganism and stop offering up sacrifices, or encouraging his military to offer up sacrifices in thanksgiving for winning against a guy named Licinius' army? Hard to say, because as we know from what biographical material we have on him, he waits to the very end of his life to be baptized. And so it's kind of a mess. It's still a big issue historians debate over. Anyway, shortly thereafter, so Constantine slowly but surely works at becoming the sole emperor of Rome again. In the midst of that history, 312, 313 AD or thereabouts, he with some of the other still co-emperors that are hanging around decide that enough is enough with the persecution of Christianity. And the issue to bring an end to the Diocletian edicts, what's called the Edict of Milan. You can probably guess where it was written, Milan. And what the Edict of Milan essentially establishes as law in the Roman Empire is that Christianity is now no longer illegal. There's no way you can justify the arrest and persecution and execution of Christians unless they're actually guilty of some sort of civil or criminal crime. So that's a tremendous moment in Christianity. For the first time, it's legal. And what you see in the wake of that is Christians come out of the woodwork. A lot of them had gone through the Diocletian persecution. There were some who resisted renouncing the Christian faith, but were not put to death. And so when the Council of Nicaea, from which we get the Nicene Creed in 325 AD, there's stories from how all these bishops across Christendom start gathering in Nicaea. They're coming with, many of them are limping, some of them are missing an eye. There's wrists that have been cut, or hands that have been cut off, all from the persecution they endured under Diocletian. So they get to the Council of Nicaea, which Constantine, so probably at this point in 325, or the years leading up to it, he's probably most historians are comfortable with saying that he's probably left behind his paganism and he's embraced some 4th century version of Christianity that's not far from an Orthodox version of it, a small Orthodox. After the Council of Nicaea, which is it's the first what's called ecumenical council, that is a council that's binding on the whole Christian church. That council is momentous because it dealt with lots of things, but the biggest issue it dealt with was the problem of what was called Arianism, named after this guy from Alexandria, Egypt, named Arius, go figure, that's why we call it Arianism, who started teaching in churches in Egypt, and it quickly, for a variety of reasons I assume, spread everywhere. It becomes tremendously influential. In fact, some who study this stuff, these 4th century historians, they'll say, had the Council of Nicaea not taken place, Arianism may have taken over what you and I know as classic creedal Christianity, because people were falling for it everywhere. Probably because Arius taught something that was a little more, what's the word? Easier to comprehend concerning the nature of Jesus than what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that Jesus is fully God and fully man. Arius says he was a man, to be sure, at best adopted by God and made sort of a divine son by the process of adoption, but he is not, said Arius, co-eternal with God the Father. That is, Jesus in some way was also a creature, maybe a special way, but he's a creature of God, not fully God along with the Father and the Holy Spirit. So that stuff starts spreading like wildfire among some in the Roman Empire, but especially as you get to the edges, the geographical edges of the Roman Empire, it starts catching on for whatever reasons. I think probably because it seems a little more, if you will, I'm using air quotes here, meaning I'm not saying this, somebody else is, it's a little more comprehensible to reason to think of Jesus that way, rather than to think somebody who walked in time and space, was God in flesh, and actually died on a cross. Now, if it's a creature, that makes a little more sense, perhaps. Arius was resisted by his bishop, a guy named Alexander of Alexandria. Then he was resisted probably most vehemently by a fairly famous church father named Athanasius, who wrote this work on the Incarnation. C.S. Lewis said that work, it's like 40 pages, I think, 50 pages. That work is one of those books that you should read periodically throughout your life, not just like a one-time kind of thing. And don't do what Francisco does and crack the spine on a book, put it on a shelf so it looks like you read it. Anyway, Athanasius, Alexander, and a bunch of them congregate at Nicaea. By 325, the Arian controversy is condemned. There's a famous, probably more legend than real story that comes out of that, where one of the bishops, Bishop Nicholas, went up to Arius and smacked him in the face. Those church councils sometimes in the early days were they're not like LCMS conventions where everybody's like sitting there grumpy, pushing buttons to vote, but rather they're getting up and duking it out. Well, at least in this one case, maybe something like that. Anyway, right after the Council of Nicaea, Constantine's mother, not sure of the circumstances and how long it took, how it was funded, or anything like that, but Helena goes down to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage. And when she's down there, she hears about, and maybe heard about it already in Constantinople, that the earliest Christians had taken the cross, actually the 3 crosses on Golgotha that day, that Good Friday, and sort of put them in these special cases and hid them away. The story is that when she's down there on this pilgrimage, she asks around, and she's the mother of the emperor, so people are willing to tell her stuff that they otherwise wouldn't tell people they're suspicious might end up persecuting them. She finds it, she locates them, and most of the early sources say that she brings them out of hiding, and shortly thereafter, through some sort of orchestration, her son Constantine works at building what's now called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If any of you have been to the Holy Land, I've only seen pictures of it. My trip to the Holy Land was when I was probably 19 years old. I was in the Navy and I was more interested in pizza parlors and nightclubs when I was on Liberty in the Navy at that time. Could have done a whole Holy Land trip for free, paid for by the federal government, but I decided to hang out with Israeli girls who carried firearms, which I thought was awesome as well. That was a long time ago, over 30 years ago, 40 years ago almost. No, 30 years ago. Anyway, so he builds the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the true cross, the cross that Jesus was crucified on, according to the sources, is put in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is connected to what they think is Golgotha and so on. So it's an object of veneration from the 4th century onwards for Christians making pilgrimages. Even if you don't think there's something special about that wood or some healing property or something, it would be really cool to see something like that. Allegedly, the true cross had the signage on it still, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews on it, and so on. The story goes silent, though, apart from a few little pilgrimage reports of Christians seeing it and venerating it over the centuries, until we get to the 600s. In the 600s, there's a war taking place between the old eastern half of the Roman Empire. The West has fallen to barbarian invasions back in the 400s. The eastern half of the Roman Empire, so basically if you drew a line, like a vertical line, just to the east of Italy, through the Mediterranean, that whole part of the Roman Empire is still intact, and it's ruled centrally out of Constantinople, the city named after Constantine. At that time, in the 600s, in the first decade of the 600s, there's a war that's taking place between that part of the Roman Empire, now called Byzantium, and the Persian Empire. It's an emperor named Heraclius, or Heraclius, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and a Persian Shah, which is usually translated king, but some would translate it emperor, named Khosrow. And they're at war with each other for over a decade, back and forth. And they're exhausting, the empires are being exhausted. In the early 620s, the story is that Khosrow, the Persian king, who is a Zoroastrian, which is an old religion, there's maybe 400,000 of them left in the world. If you know the band Queen, Freddie Mercury, you remember? There's a movie about him not too long ago. He was a Zoroastrian. I don't remember real distinctly, but I kind of remember there was some controversy about what to do with his body after he died. Could he be cremated the way Zoroastrians have always done it, on top of a pyre or not, and so on. But that Zoroastrian religion has been around for a very long time at that point. So Zoroastrians are fighting Christians, and it's back and forth in terms of who's winning. In the early 620s, the story is that Khosrow's forces are able, they decimate a Byzantine/Roman army just outside the Holy Land. They make their way in as a sign of the triumph. They go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and steal the true cross. It's okay. It turns out all right. Then it gets bad again. And then, so they steal it. This is mid-620s. The wars ensue. And then 627, 628, the Byzantine army is able to restock and replenish, and they're reinvigorated. And the last battle of the Byzantine, what are sometimes called the Byzantine-Sassanid Wars, the Roman/Persian Wars, come to an end. And Khosrow, as a sign of compliance in the defeat and in the truce that was established, hands over the true cross back to Bishop Heraclius, and it's put back in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That's 628-ish. And anybody know what else is going on at the same time? That it's not Christian history, but is part of
Islam.
Wasn't
Yeah,
there?
there's a guy. It wasn't there?
I wasn't there.
Oh. But of course you read this history. On Saturday mornings you get up and I should probably learn about Byzantium today. Yeah, it's the same time that there's a guy down in the Arabian Peninsula, what we call Saudi Arabia, who is in 628 had, at that point, for 6 years, come to believe that he was a prophet of God. The term he used was Allah. And he had moved from the city of Mecca, which was his hometown, where he wasn't well received, to a city called Yathrib. Its name was changed to Madinatu Nabi, the city of the prophet. And he was starting to, in 628, when the true cross is restored to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in 628, he is pretty much consolidated control over the entire Arabian Peninsula. He's still got there's still some resisting Bedouin nomadic tribes, and there's still some, be careful with how I describe this, there's still some Jewish elements within the Arabian Peninsula that he's got to deal with. But 628, for all intents and purposes, Islam is alive and well. Persia to the north, so what we think of Iran and Iraq. The Roman Empire, Byzantium, to the northwest, has just gotten done fighting about a 2-decade-long war. They're weakened. Their borders are pretty much abandoned. Their borders in the south are pretty much abandoned. The Arabs are united under this new religion called Islam, and they don't just waltz into these empires, but within a few years, people who were otherwise, just a few years prior, nomadic people, like who literally just sort of made this sort of circumference around the Arabian Peninsula, all of a sudden are now like this political entity. They go in about 5 years, by 637 at the latest, the Persian Empire is gone. And those former Zoroastrians, and there were some Christians mixed in the population, mostly Nestorian Christians, like heretical type Christians, they are slowly but surely converted to Islam. The old temples, some of the churches are transformed into mosques. And then the Roman Empire, Byzantium, is slowly but surely carved away or carved apart as well. By 638, when the Persian Empire falls, there's an army in the west that is marching into Jerusalem and will destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The record kind of goes silent there. Nobody knows really what happens with the true cross until about 600 years later a story pops up. But the medieval Christians had heard about this true cross that was maybe destroyed or perhaps hidden away by Christians when the Arab Muslims invaded Jerusalem. And as the Crusades are starting to get rolling, one of their objectives is not just to liberate Christians who have been conquered by Muslims and decades and centuries past, but to also recover holy relics and to restore the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and so on. So the Crusades, is that clock? Okay, there's one very conscious way of doing this.
It's a little fast.
Okay. So the Crusades, you've probably heard about them. You've always heard that they're really icky and a terrible example of what Christians who have undue influence in the secular arena can do. Yeah, for the most part, that's generally true. But if you look closely at the story of the Crusades, it's a little more complicated than that. There's a church council that's taking place in the 1000s, 1085, in a little place in France called Clermont. And the Pope at that time was a guy named Urban II. And they're dealing with things like secular rulers, like princes and counts and things, buying up ecclesiastical offices. You know, they're like paying the Pope or others, saying, hey, in generations past, hey, we want that church, and we want the property that goes to that church, and so they're like, here's some money, just make us a bishop. And they call it simony. And so they're dealing with issues like that. No like real theological issues in terms of orthodoxy at that point. But as the council is proceeding over the days, Pope Urban II in November of 1085 gets word that something's taken place in and around the Holy Land. He's fully aware that that's now ruled by Muslim rulers, but he knows there's most of the population is Christian with some Jewish outposts. And he hears there's this group of not Arab Muslims, but Turkish Muslims, Seljuk Turks, who are cousins of the Ottomans, who will appear a little later on, have moved into Syria, or what we call Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and a little part of Egypt at that time. And they are removing the Arab Muslim rulers who had kind of established a status quo with the Christians there. They said, as long as you allow us to rule and you don't resist our rule and you obey the laws of Islam, you can do your thing here. The Seljuks come in, and they're like fire-breathing Sunni Orthodox Muslims. And they look at how relatively tolerant the Arab Muslims are treating the local Christians. They say, this is not in accordance with Islam. So they take over ruling the region. This is in the 1070s. And then they begin this pretty awful persecution of Christians, not just pretty awful, terrible persecution of Christians living in the region that goes on for over a decade into the 1080s. We don't have eyewitness accounts, but we have people who heard eyewitnesses who wrote down what was going on there. And one of them, this is going to get a little gross, but it's history, so you just have to suck it up and bear with it. One of the reports written by a guy named Robert the Monk says that the Turks are rounding up Christians and demanding that they apostatize from Christianity and become Muslim, or otherwise they're going to be executed. And he says the favorite form of persecution and execution of the Turks was to take Christian males and or Christians, cut around their belly button, pull out what you can pull out, tie it to a stick, nail it to the ground, and start whipping them. So they're kind of running around and their innards are spilling out. Christians did it to other Christians too, really. So it was just to put a nice balanced view of how awful things could be in the past. Makes 2024, as weird as it is, look not so bad. They do that, and then the Christian will fall over eventually, and then the Christian will be taken and put up on a cross. Women who are pregnant would have their bellies cut open and the child taken out and thrown into, and a mock baptism would take place in the churches that were there. That's filled with the blood of adult Christian males in the region who had just been circumcised forcibly by Turks, and so it's in other words, it's really awful. And Pope Urban II, I have zero interest in defending popes or the papacy, just for the record. And I think there's a red light, so it means I'm being recorded. I do believe the office of the Pope is what the confessions say it is. Probably know what that is. Antichrist. But history is what it is. Urban II gets word of this. In the 11th century, when Europe's kind of a mess politically, there's kind of people who would call themselves emperors, but by and large there's just kings and all sorts of local rulers everywhere. Urban II gets this report. What's he to do? And he's the only guy that actually has authority, some sort of persuasive authority over European Christendom. So he says, we've got to help these people. Even though they're far away, they're our neighbors. So at the I think it's November 10th, if memory serves me correctly, 1085, on the chapel service that day at the council, he recounts what he's learned about what's going on in the Holy Land, and he issues the first call to a crusade. And all the bishops that are gathered there respond by saying, Deus vult, God wills it. I don't know how they knew what God willed concerning that, but that's what they said. And it takes some time, and there's all sorts of, I don't know if they're hilarious, they're goofy at the very least, attempts by medieval Christians to rush to the Holy Land to fight the Turks and liberate the Christians living there. For example, there's this thing called the People's Crusade. So the official powers, authorities in Europe are making efforts to gather up supplies, get together leaders for a projected crusade in the near future. But then there's all these really zealous people, just normal run-of-the-mill type of people who don't have a whole lot of resources, who just simply take up, I don't think they had pitchforks back then, but axes or whatever they had, and they just start heading eastwards. And they get to what we call Turkey today, and they got to cross the place called the Bosphorus, it separates the Black Sea from the Mediterranean. And the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople is like, what do I do with these thousands of Western Catholic Christians? And in that time, and still to this day, Catholic Christians and Orthodox Christians in the East, big O Orthodox Christians, saw each other as heretics. What am I supposed to do with all these heretics? They got weapons and they want to cross. He's like, they're going to do something terrible to my city, so let's just ferry them across and let them go. And so they make their way into Turkey, what we call Turkey, and they're slaughtered. Thousands of them slaughtered by the Turkish, what are called Ghazis, holy warriors who are posted on outposts of Islam. Slaughter them. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Catholic Church in concert with all the princes and nobility in Europe are working at gathering up official armies. Make a long story short, within 10 years of the Council of Clermont, 14 years of the Council of Clermont, they've made their way all the way through Syria and Lebanon, conquering all the way along, and by, I think it's July of 1099, they're in Jerusalem, and they liberate the city of Jerusalem from Turkish or Muslim rule. And they'll rule over that region for a little shy of a century until they're defeated themselves in 1187 by a guy named Salahuddin, who's going to remove pretty much every last vestige of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Story is starting to get interesting here with the True Cross. In Crusader reports, which are filled with all sorts of stories that just seem a little questionable. As they're fighting the Turks, they talk about how as they're slaughtering the Turks, they can see the angel Gabriel and Michael and so on slaughtering Turks alongside of them and so on. So it's hard to know what's history here and what's fiction and what's in between. But in some of the Crusader reports, they talk about after they have conquered in 1099 all the Eastern Mediterranean region that was once part of the Roman Empire. They start recovering relics, and they recover the True Cross that Christians had hid away back in the 600s to keep it protected from any subsequent Persian or Arab conquests. So they recover the True Cross. Because they know the region is tumultuous, they decide we're not going to risk putting it back in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because the Arabs or the Turks might respond and take it and destroy it. So they send it back to Constantinople. And it's put in a church called the Hagia Sophia, which is now just now it's a mosque. It was a museum. It's now a mosque again. It was put there. The Crusades are continuing to go on. 1187, they lose Jerusalem. They lose all their other kingdoms that they've built up in that region. And so later popes in the late 1100s and in the early 1200s are always trying to recover that land that they've lost. So in the early 1200s, 1202 or so, they raise up what's called the Fourth Crusade. All these Christian nobility are planning to go to fight the Turks again. They march, they get to Constantinople, and the emperor's like, we don't have enough food or other thing that you need to stay here. And you're not going to be able to resupply to begin your march southwards, so we don't know what to do. The Crusaders get mad and decide, hey, let's launch a crusade against Constantinople. So it's the Fourth Crusade, 1204. They go into and sack all of Constantinople, including the Hagia Sophia. The Pope actually excommunicates them all for doing it, because these are still, though they're heretics technically in the mind of the papacy, they're still Christians. And here's where the true cross pops up again. In the sacking of the Church of the Hagia Sophia, the true cross is broken up into a bunch of fragments. Now, we don't know if it's the true cross, so it's like, who knows what's going on here. These are the stories that are told. And then all those fragments then, those splinters from the true cross, are then sent by the Fourth Crusaders in order to earn the favor of the Pope westward. And then a bunch of them are kept in the Vatican. They're spread out through all the churches that can afford a piece of the true cross throughout Europe. And so now Christians no longer have to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, where they might risk life and limb, or they might risk being captured by the Muslims. They can just go to their local church, or the nearest church that has a relic of the cross. Let's fast forward, just for the sake of time, into the time of the Reformation in the 1500s. Calvin for sure said this. I think Luther may have said this as well, that as they're protesting the superstitions that surround relics in their own day and age, that you can go and just behold a splinter of the cross and whatever ails you is going to be fixed, or maybe you can hold like what we might call a thimble full of Mary's breast milk. They had this stuff, and it's been around for 1500, I don't know, there must have been something funky about it, but they had relics for everything, including lots of splinters of the alleged true cross, such that Luther, or Calvin for sure, maybe even Luther, said there are so many splinters of the true cross that it could fill up an entire ship. Meaning, who the heck knows if any of this stuff is true, what's legitimate, what's not, and so on. Anyway, it's at the time of the Reformation, too, that we start to see, as Luther, starting with Luther, we start to see a reorientation of Christianity away from, for lack of a better way of describing it, a lot of these very pious sort of practices, but ultimately wrapped up in a lot of superstition that had developed over the centuries, reoriented it back to the cross itself. As a physical object, if you will, in that it really did happen in real time, in real space. Jesus was hung on a cross, and he really did rise from the dead. The term Pastor used this morning in his sermon, I don't know if he used it in the afternoon, so now you're going to be held to it.
I may or may not.
An accomplished fact.
Yeah.
And as you know, I like to pretend I can pronounce French words. I like fait accompli. It's an accomplished fact that this stuff happened, and that the cross, there was a real cross, and perhaps it was preserved over the centuries. All that's important, but more importantly, for our eternal life, for our salvation, is what took place there and why it took place. That's not just the genius, that's the absolutely enduring importance of the Protestant Reformation. It really does restore what we, and this is a friendly audience, so I can get away with this, but I would argue in a public venue with Catholics and others that it restores authentic, biblical, historic Christianity that had been covered over and distracted by all sorts of medieval things that just sort of popped up along the line that may have started as, may have been motivated by a sense of piety, but had been corrupt over the time. Think of like indulgences. That's the one we're probably most familiar with. Indulgences, Luther in 1516, 1517 is hearing about these people coming around saying you can purchase this little piece of paper that guarantees that not only you, but you could also extend it to your relatives who are already in purgatory can get out sooner. If you just buy this piece of property, you don't have to go behold a relic. You could just put a coin in the coffer and a soul from purgatory will spring. And Luther sees all this stuff. He has no issue with piety. He has no issue with retaining things that are useful for Christian piety. But he's very much interested in getting rid of what we might call all the superstitions and works righteousness type of theology that had surrounded this stuff. And he will restore, we could even say, a small c that is not Roman Catholic Christianity. It's now an evangelical. It's decidedly is a Christianity that's historic, so it's Catholic in a small c sense of the term. That is according to the whole history of Christianity. That is ordered around and always connected to the cross of Christ, not just as a historical event or a fascinating object from history, but as an actual real event where God meted out his judgment on us, on his very Son. And that's the beauty of Lutheran theology, and everything's oriented around that. So it's like 10:25 or 7 or something. Oh no, it's 10:23. We have 7 minutes. Any questions left over from yesterday, or? Yes, sir.
What, didn't Louis XVI build a chapel in Paris? It was either 16th or 18th, one of those Louis. But built a chapel in Paris that supposedly had the relics of the cross in it. Had some of those relics. It's a really cool place to listen to Bach. I don't know that.
I believe so.
Saint-Chapelle.
Yeah,
I believe so, but I
Saint-Chapelle, yeah, it's by the police station. So if you go in there and look at it, kind of,
I only like to pronounce some French words.
yeah.
Otherwise, I'm not a big fan of the French. I've mentioned the name John Warwick Montgomery a couple times yesterday and maybe today. He lives in Strasbourg, way up in the northern parts of France, and he's now very old. But back in the day, you know, anytime I go over there, I used to help him teach sometimes at his apologetics academy there, and he'd always, because Rosenblatt was very much like a think Tea Party type Republican American, and he'd bring it over to France, and Montgomery and fashions himself this sort of cosmopolitan guy. And the first conversation with Montgomery was always his defense of French culture and how great it is over against German culture and American culture. So out of rebellion against Montgomery, I make fun of the French any chance I get. I believe you're right. I think the Bourbon kings, certainly before the French Revolution, so it would be Louis XVI and before, were all about restoring they were trying to establish, they had for a long time, centuries at that point, a Catholic church that was a national church in France, as opposed to a church where it's with its headquarters in Rome. You know, of course they paid homage to and respected and recognized the Pope as the head bishop,
Right.
but they were interested in a national church. And the way to establish the preeminence of the national church is to amass as many relics and build as many beautiful churches and cathedrals as possible. And that's where we get all the great French architecture, much of which was destroyed by French revolutionaries not too long thereafter. Democrats in the 18th century, sense of the term, destroyed it all. And sorry, I had to throw that in there. Yeah.
Question. Could you enlarge on Luther's take on when, after the Reformation, when his followers were knocking the statues and everything apart in the church, in the Catholic churches, his take on the symbolism that was there? I mean, he touched on the relics and stuff like that, but
Yeah, so in the Protestant Reformation, very quickly, even in Wittenberg itself, there are these people who are inspired by Luther. They've not studied with him fully, because we're still early in the days of the Reformation. Luther's hiding for about a year, in the Wartburg Castle that's still people teaching and learning at the University of Wittenberg. They're taking Luther's idea and his, maybe even his disposition of saying, rejecting the papacy, but then extending it to rejecting all of institutional Christianity and trying to start anew. And for lack, there's a little more nuance to it than that, but some of them will become, they make up what's called the Radical Reformation. And it starts almost immediately in the early 1520s. If you've heard of names like Thomas Munzer, the Zwickau prophets, there's a little episode of Luther's life. Karlstadt is probably one of the more famous ones. In mid-1520s, he decides that he's going to take the reins of leadership of the Reformation. So he appears at divine service one morning with then no clerical garbs. He's dressed like a common person, a peasant, I think, and basically removes the church, does whatever he can, he and his followers, to remove the church of any sort of symbolism or any sort of traditional liturgical practices. To effect, I mean, they're real revolutionaries. They're trying to start things anew and separate entirely from the history that preceded them. Luther's very different. He wants to retain what's good. Because Luther is not a revolutionary in that sense, in that he does not want to create disorder, but he cannot stand falsehoods. So he removes what's false, keeps it true, because he knows that all people have a history, and it's very dangerous to, I'm going to say it, very dangerous to feel emboldened to do in the future what you want to do unbound by the past, whatever that phrase is. If you're unburdened by the past, that doesn't mean you just sort of preserve what's handed down to you willy-nilly just because you're a slave to tradition. But traditions are vital for a people in the political and the theological and all sorts of other arenas. So for Luther, images of even the Virgin Mary are fine so long as it's an image of the mother of Jesus Christ, and it's a devotion to it points you to the cross of Christ, not just as a historical event, but why Mary gave birth to Jesus in the first place, so that he might be lifted up and those who believe in him would have eternal life. So is that kind of...
Yeah.
You mentioned also guys so that movement is oftentimes called iconoclasm, a destroying of icons, and by icons we mean any sort, it's not just what we think about icons today, anything that is part of traditional liturgy and piety.
What does the cross mean to you?
Thank you. Is this why you raised your hand earlier?
And I want that answer to the question. What does
the cross mean to me? I think it means what it means to all of us. I hope it means to all of us. It means that God sent his very Son from all eternity to die in our place. And it's an accomplished fact, and there's nothing you can do to change it. Even if you don't like it, or you have times of doubt, and you're starting to wonder, it still took place. Can't change anything. It's like our baptism, too.
It's done.
It's done. Tetelestai is the Greek. It is finished.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
I was rambling.
No, it's good.
He started it.
Thank you to Dr.
Thank you.
Francisco for to go with the cross. And I looked at last year when I preached for Holy Cross Day, and I got into a little bit of Helena, but it was like, I can never preach the same thing again, not even between the two services. But I thought of Karlstadt and Luther writing in Against the Heavenly Prophets, against Karlstadt, who was one of these iconoclasts. And he talks about the cross, and he says, and the forgiveness of sins. He says, we speak of the forgiveness of sins in two ways, and the first is how it was won or achieved. Right? And he says it was achieved at the cross, but it's not given there or distributed there. Because we can't get in a time warp and go back there. Or we can't, just because we're next to a piece of the cross, a splinter of the cross, there's no certainty, there's no promise of forgiveness there. but he gives it continually through the gospel and the sacraments, right? These are the places he says, I'll be here for you for the forgiveness of your sin, to distribute what was accomplished in time and space and history as a completed fact, and to now be given to you and for you in these places. That's why we're gathered here to the church, right? It's because this is the place where we hear the preaching of the gospel and receive his gifts. That's wherever his word is, too, wherever we speak it in our homes and stuff. We have this great promise that the cross is brought to us, whether we understand it or not. But we should know it, right? That's the beauty of our theology, is we have the certainty of baptism and the Lord's Supper and the absolution. So let's pray together the Lord's Prayer, and then we'll go.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you again.
You'll find some white crosses back there, and